Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. We have two more very interesting panels for the rest of the day. For the next panel on building the global cybersecurity landscape, we have a stellar lineup of speakers with us this afternoon. Experts who have been key in driving the debate on cybersecurity, both at the domestic and the international stage. To share with us their views and their insights, could I please request the panelists to come on stage? Ariel Levite, non-resident senior fellow, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Ambassador Asoke Mukerji, former permanent representative of India to the United Nations. Ambassador Latha Reddy, co-chair of the Global Committee on the Stability of Cyberspace and former Deputy National Security Advisor of India. And George Perkovich, Ken Olivier, and Angela Nomellini, chair and vice president for studies, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Thanks, Darshana, and thank all of you, again, the people who've organized and put together the past 2 days. It's been fantastic. We have a great panel to discuss a very important issue about securing all of this data and all of the possibilities that we've been talking about for the last couple of days. I'm not going to introduce them because I don't want to take time away from them giving their insights to us. You have in the program their bios, and I'm sure you know who, especially the two in the middle, are already, and it doesn't matter who I am. And Ellie's spoken a number of times, so you kind of get what he brings to the table. Security, we talked about, it's been mentioned here, the Marriott hack. We've had the Yahoo hack. We've had Facebook hacks. There have been problems with Aadhaar. So consumers, I think, and people who operate in this space are very aware of how important security is, and many are quite fearful about insecurity. And yet, it's interesting in a number of the discussions in the last 2 days, whether it's privacy, we talk about other issues and security and its impact on privacy. We talk about the possibility of AI, but it assumes that the algorithms themselves will be secure, that people can't purposefully manipulate what's being done with AI. And almost everything that we've talked about, there actually is a security dimension that often isn't really addressed. And so we're going to try to address it in a couple of ways. First, kind of at the higher level, in the sense of what kinds of international norms and rules are being created or could be created to help at least limit or constrain behavior that would challenge the security of cyberspace. And it has to be done internationally because the technology itself is inherently globalized. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about implementation. So it's fine if we have states agreeing not to do certain things or agreeing that others shouldn't do certain things, but how do you actually bring it down to the ground reality? How do you implement these norms and rules? And then lastly, I want to talk about a related issue in the supply chain, and that is how to maintain the security and integrity of the supply chain, which is super important for developers, for companies, and then ultimately for consumers. Everything we were talking about with 5G, for example, will ultimately depend on so many pieces in the supply chain being secure. So we want to get to that. So the first question I want to ask for each of you, but I'll start with Ambassador Mukerji and then to Latha, is from the standpoint of security, when you look at the UN process and the group of governmental experts which established the first international norms that would address this, do you feel like there's been adequate attention paid to implementation? Are you confident about that? And kind of the trade-off between what more should be agreed to versus focusing on implementation, how you might think about that?
Well, thank you, George, for asking. You know, we've been involved with the formulation of the governmental group of experts norms since 2004. And in 2015, when these 11 norms were finally put out into the public domain, there was a very big issue regarding how to implement the norms. And the issue actually for a country like India becomes one of who decides, because there's a reference to taking, to attributing, you know, attacks on the securing the security of cyberspace, but also responding to the attacks. And the prevailing view among some of the bigger countries, powers, was that Article 51 of the UN Charter. You read Article 51 of the UN Charter, there's a specific role for the Security Council. India is not a permanent member of the Security Council, so where do we go with our own interests in the decisions that are taken on responding to cyber attacks, and if those attacks take place on us? So that's one set of issues. It's linked with the Security Council, the need to reform it if Article 51 is to be invoked. Otherwise, it makes no sense in the year 2018 to refer to something of 1945 and the privileges that were given to 5 countries at that time. The second issue, which I think happened, we are very happy, we endorsed these 11 norms that came out, but I think in India and from India we realized that these 11 norms did not fully take into account what we would call the development dimension. And I say that because in parallel the United Nations has been formulating very ambitious agendas for using cyber technology for development. There is, of course, the most, the focused agenda is Agenda on Sustainable Development, Agenda 2030. Each one of those goals has got a component for how cyber technologies will be used to implement sustainable development. And there's also a Tunis agenda from 2004, which was reviewed in 2015, which gives guidance and advisories on how this should be done. Now, in last year, the United Nations system, which are the components of the UN system, many of them appointed by the Secretary General, came up with a very ambitious document explaining how they're proposing to use cyber technologies for development. But the group of governmental experts mandate didn't go into this area. So I think in that sense, it falls short. And how do you implement it is the question. And I think that brings me to the third point, and that is that we have seen in these areas of what used to be called the global commons, that if you need to implement it, implement obligations or norms or understandings, you should do it on the basis of a predictable framework, which is normally an international convention. In the maritime domain, you have the UNCLOS, which gives you a predictable predictability of security. Now, in cyberspace, so far, there has not been much discussion on moving into using these norms as a kind of the heart of creating an international convention on cyberspace among the governments. But it's interesting that in the past few months, past year, some of the major companies have come up with proposals for international conventions. You have Microsoft's Digital Geneva Convention. You have the Google's International Communication Privacy Act. You have Siemens, which have come out with a Charter of Trust, and so on. So if big companies are already looking towards using an international convention to enforce obligations and norms, then probably the governments would have to take that into account as well.
Latha, you sat at the center of the Indian government and its efforts to deal with all these issues. I mean, and when I hear Asoke talk about how companies are now stepping forward, to me that suggests that they're doing it at least in part because governments are unable to actually do things that really work and are effective in there. When you've sat in government responsible for trying to figure this out, like how, describe in a sense the struggle or the thinking about how to translate good principles and norms into real action.
Well, you know, let me just, first I'd like to just add something to what Asoke said about the UN initiatives. I think there are three new initiatives which are very important, which we also have to look at in the UN. One is the Secretary General has set up a high-level panel, which is currently meeting and should come out with its report shortly. Interestingly, the high-level panel is chaired by Melinda Gates and Jack Ma. And there are a number of international experts on it. And it's interesting that it's a US and China big business stroke philanthropy chair or joint chairs. The second initiative is actually the new UNGGE, which is going to be meeting in 2020, I think, or 19, and will come out with its report in 2021. So they have a 2-year term. So we have to see what comes out of that, if any. Because as Ashok said, 2013, 2015 UNGGs were very good. They agreed on a lot of things, though not on the implementation mechanisms. 2017 was a bit of a disaster because I think geopolitics intervened. China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, a whole lot of others pulled back and actually went back on what had been agreed in 2013, 2015. In the third initiative in the UN, the new one, is the open-ended working group that has been suggested by Russia. And that was, both these resolutions have been adopted by the UNGA. And the interesting thing is that Russia is going to also start in 2019. The Russia proposed group will start in 2019, but their report will be out before the UNGGE. So that will give you an idea of what the final results from the new UNGGE are going to be. But the interesting thing is the UN is thinking very seriously about this, giving it very high importance, and bodies in the UN, including all states, are adopting these resolutions. So there is obviously still a role for the UN. That's number one. Number two is what you asked me. Now, when I was in government, I was given 3 tasks when I was Deputy National Security Advisor. The first was to help to draft the National Cybersecurity Policy. India was only the 3rd country in the world to come out with a National Cybersecurity Policy, and we did that in 2013. The prime movers were the Ministry of IT and Telecom, which at that time was very appropriately called the DAIT, the Department of, I think, Information and Electronics Technology. It was actually published and hailed as something good. The difficulty is, as one of the previous panelists pointed out, that it's easy to come up with a plan. The implementation is always the key. Some of the things that we recommended have been done. The Center for Protection of Critical Information Infrastructure has been set up as part of the NTRO, the National Technical Research Organization. You now have a cybersecurity coordinator for all of government, for Mr. Gulshan Rai, Dr. Gulshan Rai, who's based in the National Security Council. And I think there's generally been a heightening of awareness on what needs to be done. The other interesting thing, I think, is that norms are not being made only nationally by governments. I think there's a complete switch to a multi-stakeholder process in every country, including India. People realize that you can't do it without the private sector, you can't do it without academia, you can't do it without at least the tacit consent of civil society and the users at large. So I would say that the joint working group that we started with the private sector in the government, again, which came out with their report in 2012, was a good beginning. But we have to find a workable model where all the stakeholders can come on board and actually contribute. Because very often policymakers lack the technical knowledge. As we recently saw in the hearings of the US Congress where they were grilling Sundar Pichai of Google, the questions were not technically informed. So I think you need to have that dialogue where you have consultations behind the scenes, where the lawmakers are told what will work, what won't work. And I must say, overall in India, certainly the fact that we put our policies, our draft policies up on our website and ask everyone to comment on it. And at times we've withdrawn the draft policies when the reactions have been very adverse and gone back to the drawing board is a good sign. This would not have happened 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Government made its rules in a vacuum. Industry functioned in its own sphere, and they didn't see themselves as having that much in common. Industry, private sector saw this as kind of intrusion, a stifling of innovation, stifling of technology, and the government really felt that it had to control. I think now there's a better understanding in this area, but implementation is going to be tough.
Ellie, help bring it down, to ground realities, because we have the UN norms, and they can be important. We have, various laws and bureaus and coordinators established, but stuff keeps happening, malware keeps spreading, individuals, businesses don't adopt the practice, basic hygiene, or if there's a bug, they don't repair it quickly enough. So practice is such a great distance from what should do or what we've agreed would be good things. So, Ellie, talk about, because I know you've worked a lot about this, talk about who needs to be mobilized and how, in a sense, to actually secure this space. Can it just be left to government? Is that practical?
Well, the short answer in my judgment is no. But let me walk back and try to address, to peel off the various layers of your question. I think the first point to actually begin to come to grips with what we're looking at is to look at the incentive structure. And I think the incentive structure within governments is very different, and in many ways drives in very different directions. Intelligence and military actually want to have some opportunities to attack using cyber or to spy using cyber. Homeland Security and law enforcement are actually interested in closing those loopholes and so on. Trade, commerce, IT, whatever and so on have another set of considerations of the integrity, which is neither the preoccupation of law enforcement nor the occupation of national security. So the result is that when you talk in very vague norm basis, government might be, in some cases, be able to formulate a policy, but then it gets to the nitty-gritty, and they can't get their act together. And that is when we're talking about within governments that are major stakeholders in this business. Now you actually try to internationalize it with issues of how do people define sovereignty in cyberspace and so on, which is why I'm quite pessimistic about that aspect. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, should we give up? Or should we try to think of a different role for the government where the lead is not actually in the hands of governments? Where I come up, and I think Latha was already beginning to imply that, was number one, we have some of the major trade associations or corporations who are trying to rally behind people behind certain norms of behavior. And whether it's the Microsoft Tech Accord, or it's the Siemens of Trust, or it's the BSA with the Software Alliance and so on, that are basically understanding that unless they come forward with something that the industry is committed to and knows how to technically implement, we are in deep trouble. And so they are the ones who can both understand the commercial incentives, but can also give it kind of the technical backup, have the resources in many cases, resource both in terms of expertise and money and experts and so on, that can actually work on those issues a lot faster than governments. But more importantly, they do not frame the issues exclusively as cybersecurity. For them, the issues are quality assurance and export controls compliance and safety and licensing and customer trust. So for them, when they actually see what it takes to enhance the confidence in the integrity, they have a much more holistic picture, and as a result are willing to put at it much greater resources. So the question we have is, okay, we see individuals and we see some alliances of corporations and so on. how do we get this to actually have a much bigger bite? And I would argue that the fastest track is to rely on a few holding companies, insurance companies, financiers in this space to lay down the rules as they've done in other areas. And I'm not trying to exclude the governments, but I think with that kind of a lead and with that kind of a push, governments should then say, well, this should be off limits. Here is some, expect some modifications and so on. Here let's try and get it, not through conventions. I don't see a single convention going through the US Senate anytime soon, but at least through G20 understandings, OECD understandings, and things of that nature. World Trade Organization.
Koski, you guys, well, he was in government too, but you both were more recently in government. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, as an observer, it's clear that government doesn't have the capacity to...
I think you need it.
Oh, I hear an echo. All right, I'll do what you say. It's clear that government really doesn't have the capacity to monopolize security like they do in physical space, and that you do have to mobilize the private sector. And one of the ways to do, or among the ways to do that is you give commercial incentives. So pension funds say, we won't buy stock in companies that don't follow best practices in cybersecurity, and train their employees on best practices and all that. So you don't need a law, you're not going to get investors. VCs could adopt similar principles. But from the standpoint of experience in Indian government, when you hear that, is that going to become something that government would fight against, or is your sense that government realizes in this space that it's going to have to be a lot more flexible and mobilize people in a different way?
I'm not sure, you know, because I think ultimately even your insurers, even your pension funds, everyone is still regulated to some extent or the other. And whether or not they could introduce such punitive measures on companies without there being a pushback from the industry who would then lobby with the government is a moot point. I frankly don't think it can be done without governments. I don't think it can be done solely by governments. But I personally feel that there are some very good norms also emerging out of other bodies. And the attempt should be to then work together with the UN and with governments. It might end up being just a group of like-minded countries, and hopefully in time everybody would see the wisdom of signing on to it. It might be possible to do it through these new UN mechanisms we were talking about. But I just want to give you an example. For instance, I'm the co-chair of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, as you know. And the first norm that we agreed to come out with, which is I think an interesting norm, is non-interference with the public core of the internet. What we define that, well, let me just tell you the norm itself. It said, without prejudice to their rights and obligations, state and non-state actors should not conduct or knowingly allow activity that internationally and substantially damages the general availability or integrity of the public core of the internet and therefore the stability of cyberspace. Now, we defined this in a working group. What is the public core of the internet, which we see as the infrastructure without which the internet cannot survive, as packet routing and forwarding, naming and numbering systems, crypto mechanisms of security and identity, and physical transmission media, the actual cables and high fiber optics and so on. So I think the interesting thing is that this should be something in which every country is invested regardless of their geopolitical differences, because none of us wants the actual medium that we're using to be unable to function. So this is an example of thinking that's happening outside governments, in some cases with consultations with governments. And just the same way that the UNGGE came up with 11 norms, these bodies are also coming up with norms. And the interesting thing is the UN is beginning to talk to these bodies. They are not insisting that the two processes have to be completely separate. They are trying to learn from this process. So I think the same thing holds good for industry. For instance, Microsoft, as you mentioned, the Tech Accord, similarly Siemens, Google have all come up with different Tech Accords. So many of those norms are not that dissimilar to what governments have suggested, or even what the UNGG has suggested. You have essentially the effort there is to make sure that the supply chain is safe and secure. So again, once again, I come back to my original point. It has to be multi-stakeholder. There has to be policy as well as implementation very clearly laid out. And we all have to do this together.
Well, yeah, Latha's set it in that proper perspective. And there are, I think, two issues which arise from what you asked. One is the security of the products, the security of the systems, and it has to be on a multi-stakeholder basis, as she has said, and so on. But it's interesting that when you look at the most recent proposal by Google, they have focused on how do you use the rule of law to ensure the security of the critical national infrastructure. And one of the things that they have done in their proposal is to go down, is to try and upgrade the legal provisions which regulate cyberspace. Now, they have taken the example of the United States, and they have taken a law which applies to, currently applies from 1986 to cyberspace, and which regulates the way the United States responds to requests from other countries to investigate breaches of security, etc., using something called the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties, or MLATs. Now, the new thinking coming out of industry, but which governments probably will have to adapt, is to upgrade the existing legal structures into e-MLATs, electronic mutual legal. Now, that's the kind of synergy that we see coming out of the multilateral, multi-stakeholder sort of participation in this area. The other part, which was referred to very briefly at the end by Ari, is the World Trade Organization's role. And I think that this is something that governments and corporations would need to look at, because some of us who participated in negotiating, for example, the Information Technology Agreement and the Telecoms Agreement 25 years ago, today realize that we probably shot ourselves in the feet in India. We have, because of the Information Technology Agreement, we cannot grow our manufacturing industry in cyber products because we have a zero tariff commitment to import, and we have been swamped literally by Chinese imports. Now, how do you tackle this issue? Because again, corporations, businesses, and academia and civil society will look to governments to secure these products and so on. And I think that an opportunity is now presenting itself when globally, in the WTO and globally, we are now looking at upgrading and bringing together the rules of the road for electronic commerce. Now, I'll just give you an example. When we negotiated in 1996, 1997, we referred, for example, information technology agreement products were classified on the HS system of 6 digits, and then they went into 10 digits. But today, in the year 2018, there's no system of classification of customs rules which actually captures the technology that has come in. And this is a big challenge. And in that challenge, businesses and governments have to work together, because governments are not creating the technologies. It's the businesses which are. So I think electronic commerce is one challenge and one opportunity which the members of the WTO have, and which I think for countries like India actually is a way to revisit that whole issue of having killed the goose that lays the golden eggs for the manufacturing sector.
Ellie, when you come in, I want you to say whatever you wanted to say, but I wanted you to add something that we talked about last night, the accountability, the idea of accountability for security as well, and then we'll open it up.
All right, so I'll get to the accountability. Let me mention 3 things in response to the comments were made here by the other members of the panel. Number one, to take the suggestion Latha has talked about, we're clearly trying to identify things of a similar nature that presumably capture the common interest, all right? So the integrity of financial data being another example that we at Carnegie are working on. So there may be a handful of those things that we could agree, or at least core like-minded countries would agree. That being said, let me also introduce some caveats. And one of the caveats would be that you had mentioned that the specific norms you had in mind had internationally and substantially as caveats. So what happens is different countries have very different interpretations of what internationally and substantially would actually mean in practice.
Yeah.
But take it another step further. We have a huge challenge, and that's the accountability aspect that George is talking about. And taking those suggestions by whoever it is, well-meaning NGOs, serious people, and so on, formalizing them into state obligations, creating an incentive structure for compliance, penalize people who don't comply, and verifying that people live up to their obligations. So we have a huge challenge in front of us when we're dealing with cyberspace to take those suggestions that you and I and George and Asoke are working on, and to actually make them into kind of more binding norms of the nature that we have had and so on. But I want to take it one step further. There is a presumption here which I wish to beg to differ with, that the government's role is identified with regulation. Governments can do a great deal more. And I think the accountability of governments comes from, they can do a great deal in terms of certification. They can do a great deal in terms of sort of procurement by setting standards in their own procurement. They can define a lot in terms of requirements of what they consider to be, or benchmarking what they would think is acceptable. They can do a lot by education and outreach and so on. And in the process, develop this culture that one would want to see without actually having to lay out. I'll give you one, or do some things in the soft regulation area. To develop this accountability culture. For example, reporting requirements. That you would have to report which standards are you complying with, and that would be done in a transparent way. That you would have to report on breaches when they occur, or that you would have to report that you have contingency planning in case a breach does occur, or when a breach does occur, what it is that you would be doing, and so on and so forth. And the beauty of those measures is they could be much faster to implement than legislation that takes forever and that you have to make so many compromises, particularly as technology is evolving, and we don't want to stifle innovation. After all, we want to encourage innovation. So I think that what the challenge in front of us is to develop on the governmental side, on the corporate side, and so on, this culture of accountability that everyone contributes by making, first of all, known what norms they subscribe to, what principles they apply, what arrangements they have actually in place at a level that is consistent with their intellectual property and consistent with, commercial secrecy and so on, but still feel that in order to civilize this cyberspace, you need those, and government could help inspire those exercises.
I want to turn it to you all. I carried a box of books on the plane, which was very heavy. And so I want to say, this is something Ellie and a colleague wrote, private sector cyber defense. And so I think it might be, if it's an interesting topic for you all, they're free. So we'll leave them someplace here and take them, because I don't want to carry them back. And especially you students, might find it interesting. It's a fascinating monograph on the role that private actors could play in defending cyberspace. Let's take questions or comments from you all. We've got about 12 and a half minutes. I'll start with this gentleman because I can see you, and then...
Can you bring up the lights?
Yeah, it's a little easier to see. Great, thank you. All right. In fact, there are enough questions. Let's take like two at a time. So you ask your question, sir, and then if there's another mic right there, that's close right to you, and then we'll get to the guy in the back and so on. Okay, please.
Yeah, very good afternoon to the panel. Does financial fraudulent transactions come under cyber security law if it is covered? Can anybody, especially to Latha Reddy? do financial fraudulent transactions,
Sorry, the
do
financial?
financial fraudulent transactions, it's covered under cybersecurity law? If so, for international debit or credit cards on e-commerce fraudulent transactions, the OTP is not required. So is there anything provision to overcome that one?
Well, the policy
Thank you.
document only lays down general principles. The actual regulation of each agency, whether it's a credit card agency or other things, would actually then only follow when there's legislation to say that, when the regulation has actually been enacted. So while there's a general provision that we need to have frameworks for fighting cybercrime, I don't think this specific point has been addressed in the policy.
And then, yes, sir.
So thanks for a wonderful panel. My question is for anyone. So there are a large number of initiatives, exciting initiatives that have come about in the past month or so at the UN level and at the multi-stakeholder level. My question was, do you see these initiatives existing independently of each other and interlinking through conversations, or do you see them coming together and converging at some point in the future, either in the form of a convention or in a form where this participation is cemented into something more rigid, or do you see these just as the GCSC, the UN, the Paris Call for Trust and Security, all of them existing as initiatives that are interlinked but not necessarily turning into the same initiative in the longer run?
Can I mention that? Can I get that? Okay, well, I would say that there is already a lot of interlinking happening. For instance, the GCSC has endorsed the Paris Call. It's one of the signatories to the Paris Call at the Paris Peace Forum. Similarly, the GCSC is meeting with the UN, couple of the UN agencies in Geneva in January to discuss how the norms that we've looked at can be considered in future UN formulations. So yes, there's a lot of interlinking already happening. I don't think the idea is that they should exist in watertight silos. In fact, Professor Joseph Nye, who's done a lot of work on how cyber norms can evolve and should evolve, clearly says it can't be done by the UNGGE alone. He says there has to be simultaneous use of multiple arenas, but which also have to converge at some point. And it could be like-minded states, as I said, plus, where others join later. And you could have separate bodies looking at what should be the cybersecurity norms for the Internet of Things. Industry will pass its own norms for how they will ensure certain quality control and security controls. Insurance companies, which Ariel mentioned. And essentially, I think you have to have all the stakeholders in developing these kinds of codes of conduct, but certainly not in watertight silos altogether.
Briefly, the problem we have with the type of things of the Paris Call, which Carnegie has also supported, is the Russian, the Chinese, and the Americans are out.
The geopolitics.
Let's face it. So the reason I had highlighted, for example, the OECD initiative is because the OECD initiative is an initiative which is actually reaching out both to corporations and to non-members of the OECD. And here there is a chance that there is already signs of interest both from Russia and China and the United States, as well as from companies. So that's where I think we're looking for some kind of a common platform. A similar thing is with respect to G20. And one more thing that we haven't discussed thus far, in the TPP, but also for that matter in the Canada, US, Mexico agreement, the new trade agreements do have digital economy chapters to them. And I see the future of trade agreements having, under the title of digital economy, many of the norms that we would like to see pertaining to cyber anchored under the context of integrity of the digital economy, e-commerce, and so on, precisely as the Ambassador Asoke, as Mukerji has mentioned.
Yeah, I'll just build on what you've just said, because the fact that these norms and these activities are taking place across the board is important, because they identify the issues and they suggest some ways in which we can address these issues. there will come a point of time, and I think that this is something that in the world of the multilateral world that we live in, that's a reality. There will come a point of time when some governments will want to take this ball or these balls and convert them into enforceable norms. And it has happened, for example, in terrorism. I mean, for a long time, there have been discussions on how to counter terrorism. But ever since a forum was created, the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which brings together 35 odd countries, now those norms which were developed in the Global Counterterrorism Forum are now being referred to specifically in the United Nations Security Council resolutions. And the reason I mention it is because the Security Council resolution under Article 25 of the Charter is obligatory for every member of the United Nations to implement. So this is how they come in. They come in from outside, but they come in and then they get referenced and then they become enforceable.
I mean, I'm going to ask, one thought about that is, though, that the P5 haven't really been engaged in terrorism, so it's a little easier to embrace that kind of thing, whereas on cyber, at least several of them, actually do some of the things that we have norms that we're saying not to do, and so I think it becomes a harder,
yes,
including the U.S., it becomes a harder.
Just quick response to what you've said, and I think picking up on what Ari said, that there's the geopolitics of the P5, which is at play here. So what I have talked about in Global Counterterrorism Forum happened at a time when the P5 are part of the Counterterrorism Forum, and they endorsed in the Security Council without anybody vetoing it. So that was the synergy of the P5. Today, 2 years, 3 years down the road, there is no synergy. I mean, there's going to be a veto or there's going to be a block. And the question then will be for the industry and for civil society and for young people all across the world as to will we live with this structure in which there will be a veto or a block, and how does it help us and how does it prevent this from impacting on us? So is this going to really break up this?
Let's try to take a couple of questions before we answer so we can get there. There's a gentleman way back with like a blue shirt on, and then this gentleman with the red tie, and then we'll work our way back up front. But yeah, and hold your fire until they both ask the question. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for putting so much of the perspective on this. My questions are specific to India. Like say, when I check into websites, even of the government websites, many of the email IDs which are being used by the government officials are of the Gmail or some extension which is not even Indian domain. When we look into accountability of the government itself to protect the data, and if there's some there's a attack which is happening with the source of these, how will the government be accountable for this, maintaining the integrity of the data of the citizens here?
Great. Keep that in mind. Yes, sir. Please. No. The guy behind you, but then we'll come to you. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's working.
Thank you very much, Chair. There was a mention by the panel of the role of the armed forces and what the armed forces would like. But one would assume that in most countries of the world, the armed forces are technologically very advanced. So they probably have the relevant technology. So what should be the role of the armed forces and their involvement in drafting any such cyber security norms? Thank you.
And then this gentleman here, let's get your question because I don't want to run out of time. Yeah.
Yeah, my question with regards to the cybersecurity in terms of the healthcare data. How can countries and economies work on specific aspects of securing the patient's data in terms of using it for clinical trials or and so on and so forth? Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the first two items. Actually, I've got something on all three, but I'll keep it brief. How much time do we have? So say about 1 minute each, okay? And can we end it there?
50 seconds.
Okay, 50 seconds. First, government websites, Gmail IDs, and the whole question of e-governance. Technically, government servants have been advised by the IT ministry and by the Home Ministry, which is responsible for what we call information security, that they should not have any sensitive exchanges on anything other than a government-approved safe network. Now, if individuals are doing this, they're out of line. They shouldn't be, particularly in a government website, putting out their Gmail or yahoo.com kind of IDs. And there are rules and regulations in place, and certainly in the most sensitive sectors, there's even a ban on taking telephones or private devices into those sectors. So I think that it could be a case of ignorance, it could be a case of negligence, but technically it shouldn't be happening. I completely agree, because that creates a breach. Secondly, the role of the armed forces. The Cyber Command, for example, has recently been mooted in India, Joint Forces Cyber Command. So I think there has been a lot of work done in the three branches of the armed forces in India, and they were certainly involved and they were present when the discussions took place on the cyber policy of India. I myself have worked with several serving officers, and many of the experts in the security establishment are drawn from the signals, intelligence, and so on. Finally, on healthcare data, I think that will really be covered in the whole debate on data privacy, and which we had yesterday, you recall, that what is intensely personal data, what is the important data, what is the ownership of data. And so I think that aspect is being looked at on healthcare, and it'll also, a lot of it will depend on what comes out of the draft data privacy bill, which is being discussed in India today. That's my take.
Super, but you don't have to address all of them, but if you
No,
want.
I just wanted to respond to that point with a slight addition to what Latha has said, that yes, the armed forces do contribute. In fact, in the multi-stakeholder group that we have on cyber norms for India, we have representatives from the armed forces and the defense ministry participating and bringing their own awareness of technology issues into those discussions. So they are very much part of the national effort. The other thing I wanted to mention was actually with reference to the financial crime issue which was raised, and that has actually been addressed in the past in the internationally with the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. Many of which, whose provisions have been put into the Indian law. So what people like us who are probably norm entrepreneurs today are seeking is an international framework which will put all these pieces together into one place, rather than having different bits for cybercrime, for cybersecurity, etc. Because at the end of the day, they all get linked. You cannot deal with cybercrime and not deal with cybersecurity. That's what I like to say.
Just on the role of the military, let me add one other dimension briefly. What is unquestionable is the militaries should and would engage in offensive cyber operation in wartime. And another function would be to give support and backup to civilian authorities if they actually need this in protecting national assets. Those things go without saying. What they would do and should do in peacetime, in gray areas, and in areas that pertain to offensive operations in non-war situations and so on, is a lot more contentious. And there you have some inherent tension between doing it under intelligence authority versus doing it under military authority. The military has much more formal rules of engagement, which is a plus, but that gets the military involved in situations which are politically more contentious. So you have some tensions there, which is why one part is clear and one part is actually much murkier.
We ran over time. I hope you forgive us. I want to thank each of our three panelists, and I want to thank you for some great questions. And we look forward to continuing this, and I'll put these books out over there someplace. Thank you. Of course.
Thank you.
I'll take one of
Yeah.
Here you go. See, you've got
Lesson
customers
the Lord.
already.
Thank you so much. We'll break for a short coffee break now, and if you could please come back to the room at 3 o'clock. Thank you.